The doubt planted, the story begins on a quiet Monday morning when the sun hung low over the dusty streets of Chennai, and a young boy named Sundar Pichai was walking with slow, nervous steps toward his university classroom. His shoes were slightly worn out, the kind that made a faint scraping sound against the cracked cement, and in his bag were notebooks filled with messy handwriting and borrowed textbooks, each page holding the weight of his dreams. Sundar had always been shy, the kind of student who sat in the back of the classroom, who spoke only when necessary, and who often believed that silence was safer than being laughed at. But that morning, as he pushed open the tall wooden doors to his engineering lecture hall, he carried a fragile hope inside him. He wanted to be seen, to be recognized not for how loudly he spoke, but for the ideas that lived quietly inside his mind. He didn't know that the man standing at the front of the classroom would try to crush that hope before it even had the chance to breathe. The professor was already there, his presence heavy and intimidating. He was a man with a sharp mustache, glasses that always slid halfway down his nose, and a voice that carried the kind of authority that made students sit straighter in their chairs. People said he had been teaching for decades, that he could look at a student once and decide whether they would succeed or fail. And in that lecture hall filled with eager, ambitious faces, his eyes landed on Sundar. They lingered a moment too, long as though he had already drawn his conclusion. Sundar lowered his gaze, clutching his pen tightly. He didn't like the way the professor's stare made him feel, like he was being weighed and found lacking before he even opened his mouth. The class began, and the professor launched into a discussion about systems, algorithms, and innovations that had shaped the modern world. He asked questions, calling out names of students he already favored, and each answer was met with a nod or a smile. Sundar, sitting quietly near the corner, scribbled notes furiously, his mind racing to keep up. When a question about design principles was asked, Sundar hesitated, but then raised his hand. His heart pounded so hard in his chest that he thought everyone could hear it. The room went strangely quiet. The professor narrowed his eyes, as though surprised that Sundar had dared to participate. With a slow nod, he gave him permission to speak. Sundar's voice trembled at first, his accent thick, his words careful, but what he said was thoughtful, rooted in hours of reading. Yet before he could finish, the professor cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Stop there," the professor said, shaking his head. "This is exactly the problem. You think too small. You will never succeed in this field if this is how you approach problems. Your background, your manner, your timid voice, none of it speaks of leadership or innovation. Boys like you do not change the world. They simply follow." A wave of laughter rippled through the classroom. Students glanced at Sundar, some smirking, others pitying. And Sundar felt his throat tighten. His ears burned, his notebook suddenly heavy on the desk. He wanted to disappear, to shrink into the cracks of the wooden chair. In that moment, it wasn't just a professor's words. It was a verdict. And that verdict struck him deeply. He forced himself to look straight ahead, refusing to let his classmates see the tears that threatened to form. But inside, a storm was building. Each word the professor had spoken felt like a stone being thrown at his future. After class, Sundar stayed seated, pretending to pack his bag slowly as the others left. His hands shook slightly as he placed his books back into his bag. When the room was nearly empty, he overheard the professor speaking to another faculty member by the door. "That boy Sundar," the professor said with a dismissive chuckle. "He will never go far. Mark my words. Some students are born to lead, others are born to be forgotten. He is the latter." Those words cut deeper than anything he had said in front of the class. They weren't meant as a performance, they were meant as truth, as a final judgment. That night, Sundar walked home slower than usual. His shoulders slumped, his mind heavy. The neighborhood streets buzzed with children playing cricket and women chatting on doorsteps, but he barely noticed. When he finally reached home, the familiar smell of curry greeted him, and his mother's voice asked gently, "You're late, Sundar. Long day?" He forced a smile and nodded, slipping into his small room. He didn't want her to see the disappointment on his face. His father, tired from a long day at work in the factory, entered later, carrying grease stains on his shirt and quiet wisdom in his eyes. Noticing Sundar's silence, he sat beside him, "What happened, son?" he asked softly. Sundar hesitated, then whispered, "My professor said I will never succeed." The words came out broken, carrying all the shame and fear bottled up inside him. His father stayed silent for a long moment, then put a firm hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but steady. "People will doubt you. They will laugh at you. They will even try to break you because they cannot see what you see, but remember this. Only you decide your worth, not them. If you believe him, then he is right. But if you refuse to let his words define you, then you can still write your own story." Those words stayed with Sundar as he lay awake that night. The ceiling fan spun lazily above him, shadows dancing across the walls, but his eyes were wide open, filled with both hurt and determination. He pulled his notebook closer, flipping through the pages of sketches, notes, and half-formed ideas. He whispered quietly to himself, almost like a prayer, "I will not let him be right." And as the night stretched on, Sundar kept writing, filling page after page with plans, thoughts, and questions, his pen scratching like a promise etched in ink. Yet as he finally set his pen down, exhausted, he did not know that somewhere else in the quiet of his professor's office, another story was unfolding. The professor sat at his desk scribbling notes in a private journal. His words were sharp, his tone dismissive, and at the bottom of the page he wrote one final line. "Mark this name, Sundar Pichai, a boy destined to fail." The ink dried, sealing his cruel prediction, even as Sundar was just beginning to dream of proving him wrong. The hidden struggles, the days that followed, were heavy for Sundar. The professor's words clung to him like a shadow, replaying in his head at the most unexpected times. When he sat in class, when he ate with his family, even when he tried to sleep. Every laugh, every careless whisper from classmates seemed sharper, as though everyone around him believed the professor's verdict. In the cafeteria, he noticed fewer people sitting with him. Friends who once shared notes or exchanged jokes now looked away when he approached. Some of them did not want to be associated with the boy the professor had already labeled a failure. And though Sundar pretended it did not matter, every act of silence and avoidance chipped at his confidence. Still, there was something inside him, something his father's words had planted, that refused to let the professor's voice become the final truth. So even as his classmates studied just enough to pass exams, Sundar stayed up long hours into the night, pushing himself to read more, to understand more, to go deeper into subjects that fascinated him. He began to borrow books not just from his course list but also from other fields, wandering into sections of the library that were quiet and almost forgotten. The silence of those stacks comforted him. No one laughed there, no one interrupted him mid-sentence. Among the smell of old pages and the dim glow of yellowed lights, he felt a kind of freedom. But freedom could not protect him from failure. When exam season arrived, Sundar poured his soul into preparing. He wrote and rewrote formulas, memorized principles, and filled notebooks with problem sets. Yet when the results came back, his heart sank. He had failed one of his core subjects. The paper, stamped in red ink, looked like a wound on the table. Classmates whispered as they passed him in the hallway, their smirks confirming what the professor had said. And the professor, of course, wasted no time. In the next lecture, he held Sundar's paper up as an example. Not by name, but with enough hints for everyone to know. "This," he declared, "is what happens when you are not cut out for success. The world does not reward mediocrity." The students laughed, and Sundar felt the floor tilt beneath him. That night, he sat on his bed staring at the wall. The urge to quit pressed against him with unbearable weight. His mind whispered cruel questions. What if the professor was right? What if his quiet dreams of creating something meaningful were foolish? Maybe he wasn't strong enough, not clever enough, not bold enough. The tears he had fought back in class finally spilled, silent and hot. It would have been so easy to let go, to accept the professor's judgment and stop fighting. But just as the thought of giving up wrapped itself tighter around him, life gave him an unexpected lifeline. One evening, while wandering the library long after most students had left, Sundar was noticed by an elderly librarian. She was a thin woman with silver hair tied in a bun and a gaze that seemed to read more than just books. She asked gently, "Why are you here so late, child?" Sundar hesitated but confessed, "Because the library doesn't laugh at me." She listened quietly, then smiled, and without another word she disappeared into the back and returned with a small stack of old dust-covered books. "These are not on your course list," she said, pushing them toward him. "But sometimes the answers you need are not in the syllabus. Read these. You may find what you're looking for." Those books were worn, their pages fragile, but inside them Sundar found treasures. They spoke of design philosophies, forgotten experiments, and engineering principles that were not part of his curriculum but sparked his curiosity. Night after night he devoured them, his pen racing across paper as he scribbled ideas and questions. He began to see problems differently, not as walls but as puzzles waiting for new angles. One passage in particular caught his attention, an obscure explanation about how small, efficient designs could outlast bigger, showier ones. It was a simple concept, but for Sundar, it felt like a spark in the darkness. From that spark, an idea began to form in his mind. It was small, fragile, and unfinished, but it tugged at him constantly. He began sketching late into the night, his hands blackened with pencil smudges, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. He imagined building something simple yet powerful, something that could solve problems in ways his professor would never expect. Every time doubt returned, he whispered his father's words, "Only you decide your worth, not them." But life tested him again. His mother noticed how tired he looked, how often he skipped meals, and she worried. "Sundar," she said softly, one evening placing a plate of food beside him, "you cannot fight the world on an empty stomach." He smiled faintly, promising he would eat later, but she stayed by his side, watching him scribble diagrams she didn't understand. Her quiet presence became his strength, a reminder that even if the professor dismissed him, even if classmates mocked him, there were people who believed in him without needing proof. Then came another blow. The professor announced that an important project evaluation was approaching. Students were to present their ideas and industry representatives would be invited to watch. Everyone buzzed with excitement, but Sundar felt dread. He had no polished project, only scattered sketches and fragile experiments that often broke apart. And worse, he knew the professor would never let him present without humiliation. Still, he pressed on. Using scrap parts borrowed or collected, he began piecing together a crude prototype. It was messy, uneven, and frustrating. Many nights it refused to work, sparking only failure after failure. Sundar sat with his head in his hands, despair pulling at him, but he could not let go of the fire that had started with those dusty library books. He remembered the librarian's words. "Sometimes the answers you need are not in the syllabus," and he pushed forward again. As the deadline loomed closer, Sundar grew more anxious. Sleep abandoned him, food lost its taste, but determination carried him like a wave. He had to prove, to himself more than anyone, that he could create something valuable. He knew the professor was waiting for him to fail again, to turn his struggle into another cruel example. But Sundar had decided, this time, he would not let the professor write the ending of his story. And then, on a particularly silent night when the world outside seemed to be holding its breath, something extraordinary happened. After weeks of failures, his prototype flickered to life for a brief glowing moment. It was shaky, imperfect, but real. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. For the first time, he felt the rush of possibility, the sweet proof that his effort was not wasted. He whispered into the night, his voice trembling with both exhaustion and joy. This is only the beginning. But as he leaned back, staring at the small device on his table, another fear crept in. What if the professor found a way to crush even this? What if he stripped Sundar of the one fragile victory he had managed to claim? Sundar did not know it. Yet, but the coming days would bring him face to face with his greatest test. The breakthrough. The rumors spread quietly at first, carried in whispers that floated through the dusty corridors of the university. Some students noticed Sundar slipping into the library long after classes ended. Others saw him leaving the labs late at night with smudges of grease and tired eyes. The whispers reached the professor sooner than Sundar had expected. One afternoon, as the class gathered, the professor's eyes lingered on Sundar with a sharpness that made the boy's stomach twist. "Some of you," he said, his tone coated with disdain, "waste your nights chasing silly experiments instead of focusing on your studies. Ambition without discipline is nothing but a recipe for failure." Though he did not speak his name, the glance was enough for every student to know exactly who he meant. Laughter rustled through the room and Sundar sat silently, gripping his pen until his knuckles turned white. Despite the professor's words, Sundar pressed forward. Every failure in the lab only deepened his resolve. His small prototype often sputtered and died, wires coming loose, circuits overheating, and designs collapsing in frustrating silence. Yet every time he wanted to give up, he remembered the brief moment when the device had flickered to life, fragile but alive like a candle refusing to be extinguished. That image burned in him, refusing to let him surrender. Nights in his tiny room grew longer. Electricity was unreliable, so when the lights went out, Sundar continued by candlelight, his face glowing with determination. His mother sometimes peeked into the room and sighed, worried by the dark circles forming under his eyes, but she never stopped him. Instead, she left a plate of food beside him, even when she knew he would forget to eat until it was cold. His father, though often too tired from his factory job to say much, placed a quiet hand on his shoulder one evening. Without words, it was his way of saying, "I see you and I believe in you." As weeks passed, Sundar realized he could not build his prototype with the cheap scrap alone. Certain parts were too costly, too rare. He almost gave up then, until his father made a sacrifice Sundar would never forget. One morning, his father handed him a small package wrapped in old newspaper. Inside were a few of the crucial components he needed. Sundar froze, recognizing them instantly, and realizing their price. "Appa," he whispered, voice trembling, "how did you—" His father silenced him with a gentle shake of the head. "Don't ask, just build. Some dreams are worth more than possessions." Later, Sundar would discover that his father had pawned a small gold chain, a family keepsake passed down for years, to buy those parts. The weight of that sacrifice settled heavy on Sundar's heart, but it also gave him fuel. Failure was no longer an option. Slowly, painstakingly, he rebuilt. Every screw tightened with care, every wire connected with precision. His hands shook not from uncertainty, but from the enormity of what was at stake. And then, one night, as he connected the final piece, his prototype sprang to life more steadily than before. Its simple mechanism worked exactly as he had envisioned. Sundar exhaled, his chest rising and falling with relief. It wasn't perfect. It still needed refinement. But it was alive. In that moment, he felt as though he had stepped into the future, glimpsing a world where his ideas could breathe, where he was not the timid boy mocked in classrooms, but a creator capable of building something lasting. The announcement for the project evaluation day came soon after. A panel of industry representatives, including engineers from well-known companies, would be visiting to observe student projects. It was the kind of opportunity that could change lives. Many of Sundar's classmates buzzed with excitement, already preparing polished presentations, their professors cheering them on. But when Sundar signed up to present his prototype, his professor's lips curled into a cold smile. "You?" the man scoffed. "Do not embarrass this institution. If you insist on showing your toy, be prepared for humiliation." The words stung, but Sundar stood firm. He had not come this far to shrink away now. He poured every ounce of effort into refining his prototype. He rehearsed explanations late into the night, speaking to himself until his voice grew hoarse. Sometimes he imagined the laughter of his classmates as he spoke, forcing himself to continue despite the fear. Other times he pictured his father's weary face, his mother's watchful eyes, and he drew strength from their sacrifices. The morning of the presentation arrived, and the campus buzzed with energy. Students carried their projects into the hall, some sleek and polished, others ambitious but incomplete. Sundar walked in quietly with his modest prototype, cradling it as though it were fragile glass. Whispers followed him, mocking, dismissive, "What is he doing here?" someone muttered. "He'll be destroyed." Sundar ignored them, though inside his chest his heart raced. When it was his turn, the professor stepped forward as if to stop him. "This is unnecessary," he told the panel. "This student is wasting your time." Sundar felt his face burn, but before he could step back, one of the visitors raised a hand. "Let him present," the man said firmly. The professor's jaw tightened, but he had no choice. Sundar stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he set the prototype on the table. He took a deep breath, remembering his father's words, his mother's quiet support, the librarian's gift of dusty books. Then he began to explain, his voice unsteady at first, but growing stronger with each sentence. He spoke not just about the device, but about the principles behind it, about why simplicity often outlasts complexity, about how small ideas could lead to big changes. The judges leaned in, curious. Sundar pressed a switch, and for a terrifying moment nothing happened. His stomach dropped, panic tightening his chest. He could hear the stifled laughter in the room, the professor's smirk. But then, with a faint hum, the prototype whirred to life. It worked. The mechanism demonstrated exactly what he had described, and for a moment the room fell silent in surprise. Students who had mocked him leaned forward, astonished. The panelists exchanged glances, impressed. Sundar's heart soared, but before he could savor the moment, the professor spoke up sharply. "Lucky accident," he muttered loudly enough for all to hear. He could not possibly understand what he has done. His words stung, trying to snatch away Sundar's fragile triumph. Still, Sundar stood taller than before. This time he did not let the professor's voice drown him. He met the eyes of the panelists, explaining calmly how he had designed the prototype, the nights of testing, the failures and the refinements. His words carried the weight of truth, and the panelists nodded, recognizing the depth of his effort. But as Sundar packed up after the session, his chest still tight from adrenaline, he caught sight of something that unsettled him. In the corner of the hall, the professor stood speaking quietly with one of the panelists, his gestures sharp, his expression dark. Sundar strained to hear, but caught only fragments. "Don't encourage him. Waste of time. Not leadership material." Chill ran through Sundar. It wasn't over. The professor wasn't done with him yet. The humiliation turned power. That night after the presentation, Sundar lay awake in his small room, staring at the ceiling fan that turned slowly above him, its blades groaning with every rotation. He should have been proud, even triumphant. His prototype had worked in front of everyone, even if only for a few fragile minutes. The panelists had seen it. They had nodded with curiosity. Some even smiled, yet the weight of the professor's smirk pressed heavier on his chest than any applause could lift. Sundar had overheard enough to know that the professor was not going to stop. Instead of acknowledging the effort, he was whispering doubts into the ears of the very people who might have given Sundar a chance. "He could not possibly understand what he has done," the professor had said. "It was a lucky accident." The words echoed through Sundar's mind like poison. Days later, the results of the project evaluation were announced. Several students received glowing remarks, their names mentioned proudly in the report. Sundar's project, though noted as interesting, was buried beneath dismissive language. "Needs significant improvement," the report said. "Potential unclear." Sundar knew whose fingerprints were behind those words. His classmates snickered, some congratulating him sarcastically, others simply shaking their heads. It felt like victory had been stolen from him just when it was within reach. The professor, sensing his discouragement, only pushed harder. During lectures, he used Sundar as an example of failure cloaked in effort. "You see?" he told the class one morning, gesturing toward him without hesitation. "Hard work without talent leads nowhere. Don't fool yourselves into thinking persistence alone will save you." Sundar sat frozen, shame spreading through him like fire. It was one thing to be mocked by peers, but to be ridiculed by the very man meant to guide him cut deeper than any wound. Yet something unexpected stirred inside Sundar. The humiliation, instead of breaking him, began to harden into something stronger. It was no longer just about proving the professor wrong. It was about proving to himself that his worth wasn't dictated by another man's bitterness. Each cruel word became fuel. Every laugh from classmates became a reason to push further. So he worked. He refined the prototype again and again, improving its stability, reducing its flaws. He began reading beyond the old books, diving into journals, searching for ideas across disciplines. He learned not just to solve problems, but to think differently, to question assumptions. Each failure taught him more than the professor's lectures ever had. When another opportunity arose for students to showcase their work at a smaller departmental seminar, Sundar decided he would not back down. He signed up quietly, prepared his notes, and carried his prototype, still imperfect but stronger than before. The hall was smaller, the audience mostly faculty and students, yet the tension felt heavier than ever. Sundar stood by his table, his hands trembling as he set everything up. The professor, seated near the front, wore a look of barely concealed amusement. When Sundar's name was called, a murmur spread through the room. Some leaned forward, curious, to see if he would fail again. Sundar stepped up, his voice unsteady at first, but as he spoke, he found rhythm. He explained his design, the philosophy of simplicity, the way small efficiencies could shape larger systems. When he pressed the switch this time, the prototype worked more smoothly. It was not flawless, but it was reliable enough to draw genuine interest. A few faculty members leaned in, asking questions. Sundar answered with clarity, his confidence growing. For a brief moment, he felt the warmth of recognition, the fragile joy of being seen. But then, disaster struck. Midway through the demonstration, a loose connection sparked. The prototype sputtered, flickered, and died. The room filled with muffled laughter. The professor chuckled loudly, shaking his head. "Predictable," he muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Sundar's chest tightened, his throat burned. He stood frozen, shame pressing down on him like a stone. The easy choice would have been to stop there, to pack up his broken device and flee the room. But Sundar remembered his father's sacrifice, his mother's quiet strength, the librarian's gift. He thought of the night spent bent over his desk, whispering to himself that he would not let the professor define his worth. So instead of running, he bent over the prototype, adjusted the loose wire with steady fingers, and tried again. This time the mechanism whirred back to life. It wasn't perfect, but it worked enough to complete his demonstration. The audience, startled by his refusal to quit, fell quiet. The laughter faded. Even those who had mocked him earlier now watched with something that resembled respect. Sundar stood tall, finishing his explanation with a calmness that surprised even himself. Afterward, some faculty approached him with words of encouragement. "Your idea has promise," one said kindly, but before the warmth of their praise could settle in, Sundar overheard the professor once more, speaking sharply to another teacher near the door. "He is stubborn, I'll give him that. But persistence doesn't make a leader. In the end, he will still fail." Those words followed Sundar as he walked home that evening. Part of him wanted to scream, to confront the professor, to demand why he hated him so much. But another part, the quieter, stronger part, knew that silence could sometimes be more powerful than argument. He did not need to fight with words. His proof would come in time. As he reached home, his father asked softly, "How did it go?" Sundar hesitated, then replied, "It was not perfect. But I did not give up." His father smiled faintly, eyes filled with pride. "Then you have already succeeded." And yet, while Sundar found strength and resilience, the professor was not finished. In the coming days, Sundar discovered something far more dangerous than ridicule. One evening, as he walked past the faculty office, he overheard the professor speaking on the phone. The words were quiet but clear enough to freeze him in place. "Yes, I saw it. The design is clever. With some adjustments, it could be very useful. No, the student doesn't understand its full potential. If anyone asks, I'll present it as an extension of my work." Sundar's breath caught in his throat. His professor wasn't just mocking him now. He was planning to steal his idea. Theresa Sundar could not sleep that night after hearing the professor's words through the half-open office door. The sentence repeated itself in his head like a broken record. If anyone asks, I'll present it as an extension of my work. He tossed and turned in bed, staring at the shadows of the ceiling fan spinning slowly above him. His stomach twisted, with anger, but more than that, with fear. This was not just about humiliation anymore. This was about theft, about being erased. If the professor truly carried through with his plan, Sundar's effort, his father's sacrifice, his countless nights of struggle, all of it could vanish, claimed by someone who had mocked him from the very start. The next morning, Sundar walked through campus with heavy steps. Students bustled around, excited about the upcoming opportunities that awaited them. Representatives from international programs were rumored to be scouting talent, scholarships were being announced, and doors that could lead to futures abroad were beginning to open. Sundar should have felt the same excitement, but instead, dread weighed on him. How could he step into such opportunities if his own professor was trying to paint him as a failure, or worse, claim his ideas as his own? For days, Sundar wrestled with the decision. Confronting the professor directly seemed dangerous. Who would believe him, a shy student with no reputation, over a senior faculty member with years of experience and authority? Silence, however, felt unbearable. Silence meant betrayal of his own work, his own worth. Silence meant allowing someone else to rewrite his story. In the end, Sundar chose neither silence nor confrontation. Instead, he decided on something different. Something that would allow his work to stand on its own, far beyond the reach of one man's bitterness. He began applying to international programs with renewed urgency. Late at night, while other students relaxed or celebrated, Sundar filled out applications, wrote essays, and scraped together funds for fees. Each rejection that landed in his inbox cut deep, confirming the voice of doubt that had haunted him since the beginning. Still, he pressed forward. He remembered his father's words. Only you decide your worth, not them. Then, one afternoon, as the monsoon rains lashed against the tin roofs of his neighborhood, an envelope arrived. Sundar's hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a letter of acceptance to a graduate program abroad, along with a modest scholarship. His heart surged, his breath catching in disbelief. It wasn't just an acceptance letter. It was a lifeline, proof that someone, somewhere, saw potential in him that his professor could never extinguish. Telling his parents was another moment he would never forget. His mother clasped her hands together, tears streaming down her face, whispering prayers of gratitude. His father's eyes glistened as he nodded proudly, saying only, "You have taken our dreams further than we ever could." For Sundar, their joy was worth more than the acceptance itself. Yet even with the scholarship, the journey would not be easy. Flights, living expenses, and countless other costs loomed ahead. Sundar's family, already stretched thin, began pooling whatever they could. Relatives contributed small amounts, neighbors offered help, and Sundar himself worked small jobs to save what he could. Every rupee felt like a battle won. The day Sundar boarded the plane, the professor stood on campus watching, silently from a distance. Sundar saw him only briefly, their eyes meeting across the courtyard. The professor gave a faint, unreadable smile, and Sundar turned away, carrying his worn bag, his prototype safely packed inside, and the quiet determination that he would not be defined by that man's words. Life abroad was a storm of new challenges. Sundar found himself in classrooms filled with students from around the world, many more confident and outspoken than he had ever been. The lectures were fast, the competition fierce, and for the first time, Sundar realized how small his world had been. He struggled with accents, with culture, with loneliness. Nights were long and filled with exhaustion. Sometimes he questioned if he truly belonged there, if the professor's voice had been right all along. But he never allowed those doubts to last. Each time despair threatened to consume him, Sundar returned to his work. He threw himself into research, refining his ideas, improving his designs, learning to combine theory with practicality. He worked part-time jobs to sustain himself, washing dishes, tutoring, anything that kept him afloat. He learned humility, not as weakness, but as a tool, as a reminder that greatness was born in persistence. Slowly, his efforts began to bear fruit. Professors who once overlooked him began to notice his quiet brilliance. Classmates who had dismissed his silence started seeking his insights. His ideas, once ridiculed, now drew genuine curiosity. He was invited to present at conferences where his clear, steady explanations surprised those who had underestimated him. Years passed, and Sundar's name began to surface in spaces far beyond the walls of his university. Companies took notice of his research. Colleagues admired his ability to simplify complex problems. He grew into the kind of leader his old professor had once claimed he could never be. Not loud or domineering, but steady, humble, and quietly commanding respect. Then came the moment that changed everything. Sundar stood on stage at a major technology conference, preparing to unveil a product he had helped lead, a product that would transform how millions of people connected with technology. The hall was packed, the cameras rolling, the air thick with anticipation. Sundar adjusted the microphone, his heart calm but strong. As he spoke, his voice carried not just knowledge but conviction, each word a reflection of the journey that had brought him there. The audience erupted into applause when he finished, a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Sundar smiled faintly, not basking in pride but in gratitude. His thoughts, however, did not linger on the cheers of strangers. They returned instead to the classroom where a professor once laughed at his accent, where a boy sat humiliated in the corner, and far away, in a small living room lit by the glow of a television, that professor sat watching the broadcast. His hands trembled, his chest heavy with regret. The student he had mocked, dismissed, and nearly erased was now a leader, changing the world. The regret. The letter came unexpectedly. Sundar had just returned from another long day of meetings, his schedule packed as usual with decisions that shaped products used by millions. His assistant handed him an envelope saying softly, "This one was delivered by hand." Sundar looked at it curiously. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as though written by someone old. He opened it slowly. Inside was a short note that stopped him cold. "I was wrong. Please allow me to meet you before it is too late. Your professor." The words brought a flood of memories. Sundar felt himself pulled back in time, to that classroom where laughter had pierced his heart, to the whispered judgments that had haunted his nights. For a long moment he simply sat, staring at the note. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to leave the past buried. Yet another part, stronger, quieter, knew that walking away would not bring peace. His father's words returned to him. Only, you decide your worth, not them. And now, he wondered, perhaps true worth was not proven in revenge, but in forgiveness. A week later, Sundar found himself walking through the gates of the same university where it had all begun. The campus looked different, new buildings, fresh paint, but the memories made every step heavy. Students passed by, recognizing him instantly, whispering in awe. Yet Sundar hardly noticed them. He walked straight to the small office where an old man now sat, frailer than Sundar remembered. The professor looked up as the door creaked open. Time had bent his back, dulled his eyes, but the moment he saw Sundar, tears filled them. He struggled to stand, his voice trembling. "I did not think you would come." Sundar hesitated at the threshold, then stepped inside. The office smelled of old books and dust, just as it had years ago. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Then the professor spoke, his words spilling out in broken fragments. "I was cruel to you. I mocked you, not because you lacked potential, but because I was afraid. Afraid of being forgotten, afraid of students surpassing me. I saw something in you, Sundar, something bright, and it frightened me. Instead of nurturing it, I tried to crush it. I was wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong." His voice cracked, and tears slid down his wrinkled cheeks. Sundar stood quietly listening. Anger might have been justified, but he felt none. What he felt instead was something deeper. Sorrow for a man who had wasted so much energy trying to diminish others instead of lifting them. He thought of his father's sacrifices, his mother's quiet prayers, the librarian's kindness. They had lifted him when the professor had tried to break him. And now, Standing in that room, Sundar realized he had nothing to prove anymore. "You taught me something," Sundar said softly, his voice steady. The professor looked up, confused. "Not what you intended," Sundar continued. "You taught me how powerful resilience is when the world doubts you. You taught me that cruelty can be turned into strength. And you taught me that respect is not something given, it is something earned through humility and kindness." The professor covered his face with trembling hands, weeping openly now. Sundar stepped closer, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. There was no bitterness in the gesture, only peace. "You were wrong about me," Sundar said quietly. "But I will not be wrong about you. I forgive you." For the old man, those words were both a release and a wound. He nodded weakly, whispering, "Thank you." In his eyes was a regret that no apology could fully erase, but also a relief that perhaps it was not too late to admit the truth. When Sundar left the office that evening, the setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the campus. He paused for a moment outside the lecture hall where it had all begun, listening to the echoes of laughter that had once broken him. Now those echoes felt distant, powerless. He had outgrown them,